Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Summer of Peace. I'm Philip Hellmich. I serve as a Global Peace Ambassador for the Shift Network, and I am just really thrilled that we have a good friend of ours with us for this session, and that is Glenn Aparicio Parry. And he's going to be talking with us about his new book, Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again. Love that title. So Glenn is a writer, educational consultant, international speaker, and entrepreneur with a vision to reform thinking and education into a coherent, cohesive whole. From 1999 to 2011, Glenn organized and participated in the groundbreaking Language and Spirit conferences, bringing together Native and Western scientists in dialogue. He's the founder and past president of the Seed Institute. He currently runs a think tank and regularly moderates dialogues. He's the author of the Nautilus Award-winning Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, humanity, and nature. And Glenn lives in New Mexico. So Glenn, my friend, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the program, and thank you for the Summer of Peace and the incredible blessing that offers to the world.
Well, it's a delight. And could you hold up your book for us?
Sure. This is Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again, and the cover art is done by Diane Strongbow, who's from New Mexico as well. She's Choctaw. Yeah.
Well, let's keep that. I'm going to come to the images on the book, but Making America Sacred Again. You know, clearly that seems to remind us of another saying about make America great again. So what's the correlation here?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously I'm playing off what Donald Trump said, make America great again. It's not really only Donald Trump that said that, by the way. I've heard the words come out of Bill Clinton's mouth and definitely Ronald Reagan's mouth as well. But make America great again is something about power and dominance. You know, when I think about being great in that way, I think of like the 1927 Yankees, you know, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, you know, that kind of thing. Now, for something to be sacred, that also has power. But the power is in nature, the power is in place, the power isn't in the human ego. You know, so, you know, sacred, that comes from the Latin sacare, to devote or dedicate. So it really is about invoking the whole. So to make America sacred again is about invoking the whole and actually expanding the definition of politics to include the natural world. And that's really what the key difference between what I call original politics and the politics that tends to go on now. Ever since Socrates, the West has kind of limited political thinking to how it affects human beings. And we're seeing the limitations of that worldview now, you know, with climate change, etc. We need to expand our horizons and consider all of nature in our decision-making processes, as did Native Americans, who we learned from. You know, that's another really important concept of the book, is that the actual values of this nation that are often attributed to the founding fathers were at least partly derived, and I would say mostly derived, from living Native American cultures. Liberty, equality, natural rights, that came from Native America. They had truly egalitarian societies, and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and definitely Ben Franklin had very ample opportunity to observe this, and hence it affected the course of history because they actually incorporated this in our founding documents and in our founding values, but they only incorporated it to the extent they understood it or wanted to.
Okay, so let's stay with that. To the extent they could and that they wanted to. And so there's clearly some key elements that are left out. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Yes. Let me just tell this story about, and I'll get right to that question. The key elements that are left out are women and people of color. So in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, women had a very integral and important role. It was the Women's Council that was the Wisdom Council. They met and they really provided the strategic vision for the whole tribe. Now, they then nominated a male. The chief was always male and the council was male, but they nominated those people, and they had the right to remove them by taking off the deer antlers, the symbol of authority, if they committed malfeasance of any kind. And they also needed to be good. They needed to be good to the women. They needed to be good family men. They needed to not lie. They needed to not have cheated or stolen or committed a murder or any of those things. So the women had a very balanced role in Haudenosaunee society. They were responsible for everything in the earth, such as planting, cultivating, harvesting, and the men were responsible for everything on the earth, such as hunting, fishing, and so forth. There was a balance. Later on, the 19th century women, I'm skipping ahead here, but the 19th century women that became the suffragettes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Matilda Gage, they learned from the Haudenosaunee women. That's where they got their example, because those women were living in 19th century America where they could not vote, could not run for office, had to pay taxes, but had no say in government. If they had no right of divorce. If they separated from their husbands, they lost all custody rights to their children. They could not speak aloud in church. So how did these women even have the courage to ask for equal rights? And I explained they did so because they were living next to the Haudenosaunee women, the Iroquois women, that showed them another way and showed them that they could be equal. And so when the women's movement of the 19th century starts up, and there's the famous 1848 Seneca Conference, takes place in that same territory, the women were asking for equal rights. They made a declaration of independence for women. It starts the same way, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary, yada, yada. And they said, for full equality for women and men. So they wanted full equality. Only later on, when Susan B. Anthony gets arrested for trying to vote, do they step back their demands and focus more on just getting the right to vote, because that's how they think they will change things. But back to the men, it's Ben Franklin who has the greatest influence on the founding of the United States in many ways, because he's appointed by Britain to be an ambassador to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And now the Confederacy was around since 1132, and then they made a pact of peace, a very sacred pact of peace amongst their tribes, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Mohawk, and the Onondaga, and later the Tuscarora come in. They make a pact of peace among their tribes, but they're a strong military power. So Britain asked Ben Franklin to make a military alliance with them in the French and Indian Wars. And Britain didn't realize that in doing so, Ben Franklin, who had already been printing, he was a printer, and he'd been printing Native American treaties for a long time and had a lot of understanding of Native societies. He meets Chief Canandaigua, and that changes the course of history, their deep abiding friendship, because it's Chief Canandaigua on July 4th. It's very interesting. We're just past that date. July 4th, 1744. Chief Canandaigua tells the colonists that they should unite, that they should be strong, like the Haudenosaunee are, the 5 fingers of one hand, that they should never fall out with each other. It takes 32 years between the time that Canandaigua gives this talk and the colonists separate from England. But in 30 years, they've come together. 30 years later, 1774, they form the Continental Congress, and they give Chief Canandaigua the credit. They say that his words were wise, and that's why they formed the Confederacy. Then Ben Franklin has a big role in forming the original founding document of the United States, which people tend to think is the Constitution, but that's not really true. It's the Articles of Confederation. They come in, and they're ratified by, in 1781, France and Morocco recognized the United States as a country. And from 1781 to 1789, when the Constitution is ratified, the Articles of Confederation are the principal document of the country. And they are a country. You know, there were even 8 presidents before George Washington. Nobody talks about that because they all had 1-year term, and they had no power except the power that was derived from the legislature, similar to a Native American chief and council. So the Articles of Confederation were very close to Native American ways. In fact, all the politicians served for free. Let that sink in for a moment. Nobody received any salary of any kind, no emoluments of any kind. They just did it out of service, which is still the way it's generally done in Native American politics today. So that's a little background.
I mean,
so you said, what did they leave out, right? I'm sorry, did I answer that question? Not
well,
fully. Yeah, sorry.
You did, and Glenn, there's just so much here that I hadn't even heard of, and just about the initial seed thought for the United States. There's just so much there, and so why do you say sacred? Make America sacred again. Like, can you unpack that a little bit further? I mean, clearly we didn't incorporate everything. So how would we make it sacred again?
We can make it sacred again, first and foremost, by being inclusive. By being inclusive. If we look at nature, we see that nature's really a, polysymphonic orchestra that's everything's happening at the same time. It's a very complex world of relationships upon relationships upon relationships. Native American peoples understood this, and as back at SEED, we used to conduct dialogues between Native American elders and quantum physicists mainly, because also in Western science, we're coming back to that understanding of how everything is deeply interconnected. That's in quantum theory, that's in chaos theory, that's in relativity theory, that's in the leading edge of modern science. Has come full circle around to the way that indigenous peoples and the way our Western forebears saw the world as a radical interconnection. So that's the pathway toward understanding that it's not just that one thing is sacred, the whole world is sacred. I'm reminded of what Leroy Little Bear told me once upon visiting Yellowstone Park. He actually asked the park ranger, is Yellowstone Park, which by the way used to be part of Blackfoot territory down the Yellowstone River, he said, is Yellowstone Park an example of how we should do things so that the rest of the country will follow suit? Or is Yellowstone Park a place where we do things right so that we can trash everything else? he asked that to the park ranger. I'm sure he never got a question like that before. But it's really, really important. I take a lot of time in original politics to look at conservative and liberal views as two aspects of one whole. I do draw a distinction between the conservatism as practiced in Europe today and the conservatism as practiced in the United States. And they took different pathways, and it's probably largely because of the circumstances. The United States was this land of plenty, this immense landscape that for the founding fathers, who were envisioning this before there was even a steamboat, let alone a railroad, they thought that it would take forever to possibly inhabit this immense landscape. So Thomas Jefferson has this idea that everybody should go out and cultivate their own plot of land. And there's this kind of real strong equality in the founding of the nation because everybody kind of has a chance. They're not necessarily rich or poor, they just have a chance. And that's fine, but now things are different, you know, because we had the railroad, because we had the steamboat, because we had the airplane. The country's been largely settled, so now it's a little more like Europe. And the Europeans who destroyed their land at first have, in recent times, cultivated a more ecological ethic. And conservatives in Europe want to conserve the important things, I would say, the light, the air, the water, the earth, where the opposite happened in America, where it's just laissez-faire capitalism that won the day of the Conservative Party more and more, and especially today, so that we're just thinking about financial gain and not considering the environment. It's very sad that today the way to protect the environment is to sue the EPA. And California's done it like 50 times, you know, and they've won almost all the cases. But that's a very sad testament, because as recently as the 1970s, we had the EPA began in the Nixon administration. We had the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts passed during the Nixon administration, though I think Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act, but then it was overridden because the whole Congress really understood that we needed clean air, clean water. There was complete consensus on that. So we need to get back to that because our future depends on it.
Okay. And what inspired you to write this book now and publish it now? And also, I realize books takes a while to write, so it's probably been in gestation for a while. I mean, what inspired you?
A good question. Good question. You know, and that gives me an opportunity to really to thank my ancestors, because I pray to my ancestors before I begin any project, you know, and ask for help. And then what they want me to do is something I'm called to do, so I do it. But I'm really grateful to the ancestors or the spirits that that spoke to me to do this book. And that's why I dedicate this book to the ancestors of Turtle Island and to the next 7 generations who we have the responsibility to leave this land sacred. Because almost 4 years ago, what came through was an outline for the book, including all the chapters. You know, and one of the chapters was, you know, fascist America or sacred America. And in the 4 years, and at first, Donald Trump hadn't even been elected yet, you know, and after Donald Trump becomes elected, it becomes more and more obvious that what came through is only becoming increasingly relevant, not less. So that gave me, the fact that the ancestors were speaking through me, I guess gave me an advantage, because I had this focus a long time ago, and then I only needed to fill in events as they unfolded that tended to support what was happening. And there is this inflection point, this choice point. It happened in the 2016 election, but it's happening right now again. And we really need to decide between a sacred America or a fascist America. We're on the precipice of losing our institutions. We are definitely experiencing an enormous amount of corruption in our legal system. I mean, even, you know, and we are experiencing a breakdown of just social norms. I mean, the argument made by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt in their book, How Democracies Die, I think is a good argument. And democracies die not through because they didn't have a good enough constitution. They die because people aren't paying attention to the social norms, the norms of decency that pervaded our society. And by the way, those norms came from Native America also. There were 21 Iroquois braves that attended the Constitutional Convention, and I'm sorry, the Continental Congress before the country declared independence. And they established norms then of not interrupting. This is why the United States is so different from our mother country, Britain, where in the House of Commons, people dance and jump up and wave their arms and insult other people. You're not allowed to do that in the US Congress. Those norms came to us from Native America, but we started to lose those norms. And we could see places along the way. I mean, I don't want to blame any one person, but when Newt Gingrich came in the 1990s and the cameras got installed, CNN cameras, he began making speeches which are really just to be rebroadcast on the conservative Fox network, and so there was a lot of grandstanding that occurred, and there was a breakdown in norms of decency. And the Democrats reciprocated during the George W. Bush presidency. They compared him to Alfred E. Newman. They insulted his intelligence. If you were a conservative at that time, you thought that Bush was unfairly picked upon. That doesn't mean that George W. Bush didn't make mistakes, but he wasn't, a horrible man, but he was picked on in a certain way. The degradation of the discourse went downhill. So Donald Trump is part symptom, and maybe even more symptom than cause of what's going on today, but it is bad. Now I tell the story. Here's the key story for your viewers that really gives the meta picture of what's going on in America today. And it's a White Mountain Apache story, and it goes like this. An old woman is weaving a beautiful rug. And as she nears completion of the rug, she gets up to stir a soup that's on the fire. But while she's stirring the soup, her black dog, who's been sleeping in the corner, awakens and comes up to the rug, grabs a thread and pulls on it with its mouth and unravels the whole rug. The woman comes back. She sees the rug where there was beauty and harmony. There's now chaos and disorder. But she picks up a thread, stares into the rug for a long time, and reimagines a new way to reweave the rug in beauty and harmony. This is where I think we are in America today. We have an opportunity to see America as it really is, because the rug's being unraveled, and that's Donald Trump's role, which maybe even is a sacred role as the black dog. He's unraveling everything, so we get to see America as it really is. I never imagined that in America, I'm part Jewish, part Aragon Spanish, and part Basque. And I never imagined that in America, Nazis would be chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I should have imagined it, because in the 1920s and the second resurgence of the KKK, it merged anti-Semitism with anti-Black sentiment. But I was shocked. Honestly, I was shocked. But that awakened me, and just like now, part of white America is awakening and becoming aware of the level of systemic racism that has been perpetrated against minorities, particularly in police enforcement. The Black Lives Matter, it was the largest movement in the world, and the Women's March was the largest movement in the world before that. So all of that happened in the last 3.5 years. So I contend that we do have an opportunity to awaken consciousness, and it is happening, but we also have to have our eyes open to the fact that we also are on the precipice of fascism. So both are happening at the same time. I do have faith that a sacred America will emerge. I hope we don't have to go the same pathway that Germany did. But one difference between Germany and the United States today is that Germany took a hard look at its shadow after Hitler. They took a hard look at it. My prayer is that Americans take a hard look at what has happened right now and realize that this is their opportunity to change things and make real substantive change.
Okay.
And that will make America sacred. Yes.
Well, let's stay right there a second. Well, first of all, that story of the rug is just perfect. You know,
Yeah.
it's just everything is unraveling because it was based on a foundation that couldn't sustain. You know, and I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at that. Just the pursuit of happiness through consumerism and everything else, and all the principles that were left out. But I want to stay with this, taking a look at the shadow. Clearly, one of the biggest ones is the United States was founded on genocide. And I'm assuming you address this in your book about needing to heal the shadow, that shadow. I mean, there's slavery and then there's the genocide. Do you see this happening? Do you see this coming forward? I mean, the racism is up now. Do you see the addressing the genocide that's happened? Do you see that coming about?
Yes, it may come about, but I want to speak carefully when we say that. It's often said that the United States was founded on genocide. I don't necessarily share that belief entirely. Now, let me explain carefully. You could consider that the Indian Wars, which are commonly called Indian Wars, which are really wars on Indians, you could say that that started in the 17th century, but it really doesn't kick in until the 19th century. So there is a lot of positive interaction that happens in the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, and into the 19th century. It's not all wars. It's not a concerted genocide at that point. It becomes genocide under Andrew Jackson. And in 1830, when he declares the Indian Removal Act, and he moves, first he declares war on the Creek. Then he goes into Florida, and Florida wasn't even part of the United States then. He was prosecuting a completely illegal war. It was illegal internationally. It was illegal as far as the United States was concerned. And he goes after the Seminole. And then he rounds up the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and lastly, the Cherokee in the most brutal of all, known as the Trail of Tears. They moved them all out to Oklahoma, by the way. It's very interesting what's happened just days ago, where there's been a shift in the legal status of those tribes in Oklahoma, but that's not where their home was. It was in the southeastern United States. Andrew Jackson is considered to be, believe it or not, the founder of the Democratic Party. Really, the Democratic Party doesn't begin in name till 1840, after Jackson left office. But so my point is that in the initial years in the 18th century, even earlier with Roger Williams coming after the Mayflower Pilgrims, Roger Williams is a real peacemaker. This is the Summer of Peace. Roger Williams is the progenitor of the concept of the separation of church and state, which he basically did for the purpose of protecting Native Americans. Roger Williams was beloved by Native Americans. He learned 5 native languages. He ended up writing a book called A Key into the Language of America. And Roger Williams got thrown out of the church for his values. He rejected the doctrine of discovery, the concept that did give cover to those that thought that they had the right of genocide to Native peoples. If they were occupying land, they had the right of discovery. And Roger Williams rejected that notion because he understood that Indians had been living there. He thought it was preposterous, this idea that we were discovering something. They were already there. Later on, Ben Franklin, who was a fan of Roger Williams, another 100 years later, he makes all these profound friendships with Native America. Even George Washington makes strong friendships, and Thomas Jefferson. So my point is there was a beautiful synthesis happening, and there was some skirmishes. There were a lot of Western people who certainly didn't understand Indians, called them savages commonly. But even that is misunderstood sometimes because the word savage meant wild and untamed back then. So they had a lot of positive interaction also. And in the first 50 years of the United States, the whole world understood that the United States was a hybrid nation of part Native America and part European. In fact, the word American initially was synonymous with Indian. To be American was to be Indian. Only after the political nation starts do the founding fathers start to take on the word American also. But it was totally understood that this was a hybrid. But this shifts with Andrew Jackson coming in and deciding that he becomes the biggest agent for ethnic cleansing, and he kicks into full gear the Indian Wars, which then continue for the rest of the 19th century, and arguably in many ways have never stopped, because, you know, why are the Lakota Sioux unhappy with Donald Trump's visit to Mount Rushmore recently? Because that was given to them in the 1868 Laramie Treaty. The Black Hills were supposed to be sacred and the land for the Lakota Sioux. You know, all those treaties were written, by the way. If you ever listen to Oren Lyons, you'll know that they're all written that they would be in effect as long as the sun rises in the east and the rivers run downhill and the grasses grow green. So yes, perhaps we need a truth and reconciliation process that looks at the whole history with wide open eyes in America. But we also need to do a lot of peacemaking before it will be even possible for Native people to trust in that kind of process. Because why should they trust when we abandoned virtually every treaty that was ever made? And instead, as soon as we discovered something that we needed or needed is the wrong word, we wanted, whether it's gold in the Black Hills or whatnot, we scuttled these treaties. President Obama did a lot to reverse that, by the way. And I personally think that President Obama is possibly the reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. Now, hear me out. I don't say that in the book because, you know, but but they are both tall and thin with big ears. They both have a mole in a similar part of their face. One of them, they both were not born in Illinois, but they came from a relatively far distance. Obama from Hawaii, Lincoln from Kentucky, and through various places to get to Illinois. They serve a short time in the Congress. They then become president during incredibly divisive times. President Lincoln is the one who frees the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. And President Obama is the first African American president. So I think Obama is, for all intents and purposes, he might as well be the reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. So he did a lot of, in one respect too, he seemed to do some unfinished business of Abe Lincoln, because under Lincoln, Native Americans were treated very poorly. It was just the continuation of the Indian Wars. There's the long walk that happened in where I live, you know, from Canyon de Chelly. The Navajo are taken all the way out to Fort Sumner. That's actually reversed, so they got to come back, but that's highly unusual. But it did happen. But they, similar to the Cherokee Trail of Tears, they lost a lot in that walk. It was horrible. Abe Lincoln did, you know, when there were 300 so-called Indian war criminals, he commuted all but 39 of those sentences. So Abe Lincoln did have some kindness and compassion, and I can't say for certain what would have happened if he had gone through a second term, but there was no indication that he was going to change his views toward Native American. And I think if we look in the context of history, at that time, there was such a fervent hatred toward Native Americans who had been dehumanized under Andrew Jackson, and that continued all the way through the 19th century, that I think he was swept up in the tide of history in that regard. But Obama reversed a lot of these things. He gave billions of dollars to Native American tribes and tried to reconcile and to the extent that he could some of these treaties. And he was recognized amongst Native Americans as a very good president for that. But that gets reversed all with Donald Trump. And I would say that, and I make this point in the book, that President Obama is a lot like Abraham Lincoln, and Donald Trump is a lot like Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln and was from the opposite party. See, Abraham Lincoln made a tactical decision to put a Democrat, the opposite party, on the ticket in 1864. And he wanted to unite the country. He did that as an offering of peace. But when Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson only thinks of his own reelection, and he's very racist, actually. And he tries to slow down or scuttle a lot of what was going to happen under Reconstruction. Because it was a Republican-controlled Congress, a lot of what Andrew Johnson done was overturned, and they did impeach him just like Donald Trump was impeached. But the difference is, in the Trump era, the Republicans controlled the Senate. And here's the thing, of course, you have to realize everything has reversed. And that's what I'm talking about, the dance of the opposites. In 150 years, the Republicans have gone as far as you can imagine from their beginnings, Abraham Lincoln, all the way to Donald Trump. And the Democrats went as far as they could from their beginnings all the way to Barack Obama.
Well, Glenn, you are a wealth of information. I mean, this just started with the question of Native American genocide, and this is incredible. Well, my friend, there's a lot. We'll probably go a little over the 45-minute time here because there's just so much. I want you to speak to us about, it really looks like we're heading, the rug is being pulled out. Looks like we might devolve as a nation. Is that true in your opinion? And if so, how does the reweaving start to happen?
Good question. No, I would say we have devolved, but devolution is sometimes a necessary prelude to a higher level integration of evolution. So, that's why in the book I describe four cycles or four circles, and it's from the arc of the book is from unitive consciousness, which the founding fathers really wanted. They wanted unity. They didn't even want political parties, but they were naive. I mean, that worked in Native America, by the way. It worked much better because the tribes were united within themselves. They weren't necessarily united against other tribes. They had their own wars and skirmishes there. But eventually it breaks into the dance of the opposites with the formation of the modern Democratic and then the modern Republican Party. Then we come to today, I call that maximum diversity. And then the final arc, the fourth part of the book, is called Return to Wholeness. But each part of the book has an evolved and a devolved mode. And I want to give credit to Alfonso Montori, was a professor of mine in California Institute of Integral Studies. And back in, I think it was 2003, he said to me, when I was talking about unity consciousness as meaning a very good thing, he said, Glenn, fascism or totalitarianism is also unitive, just that everybody agrees. And he was right. So I realized then that unitive consciousness, the evolved mode, is unity in diversity. And I see that as the sacred purpose of America. But the devolved mode is totalitarianism or fascism, a unity of sameness where everybody agrees. And that's part of the struggle that's going on now. Everybody is searching for unity, but some want unity through exclusion. They want to throw out, they want to revive a white America, to be blunt about it, and others are looking for unity through diversity. And if you think about it, the same thing, all those stages I spoke about as having an evolve devolve mode. The Democratic and Republican parties, their dance of the opposites. The evolve mode would be a recognition of the integrity of the other. A devolve mode is just conflict and division. And now we're in this place where a devolve mode of diversity is this exclusion, this move to exclude, and an evolve mode is synergy and cooperation, which could lead to peace and a complex but beautiful awakening. So that's kind of where we are now. I do think that the key to all of this is love of nature. I contend in the book that a love of biodiversity and nature can lead to a love of each other. And that's really the arc of where I end the book about return to wholeness, because I see that that's something that all people can do by themselves. Everybody can go, and even in this COVID time especially, go back and explore. And yeah, you can't be around your friends as much as you used to be, your human friends. We'll make some more than human friends. Go out in nature, and there, if we learn from nature, we can see, we can begin to love each other. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be conflict, because there will be. There's conflict in nature. Things eat other things, But it's Marcellus Bearhart that said that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the resolution of conflict with love. And that's really, I think that's the second to last paragraph of the book, is when I'm speaking about that, because that's really what we need to do now.
Beautiful. Can you hold your book up again, please?
Sure. The
And
book is called Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again. There's also an audio book available if you want to hear me read you the book. I enjoy doing that. And it's available, of course, in your local bookseller if you want to.
in the symbols on that book?
Oh, the symbols of the book, yeah. The artist was Diane Strongbow. The white buffalo is a sacred symbol or a harbinger of peace. And there have been white buffalo born in the 20th and 21st centuries, white buffalo calves. The eagle is both a symbol of peace in the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois tradition, and of course it's become the symbol of America. And for Native people, the eagle is sacred because when you say your prayers, the hawks and eagles take your prayers up to higher realms. But the eagle actually sits atop the Haudenosaunee great tree of peace and observes and protects. The snake eating its own tail, which is called by Ouroboros, and Carl Jung wrote a lot about it, is a sacred symbol in many, many cultures, but it's also found in Navajo sand paintings. The snake eating its own tail is a symbol of wholeness, and it's a symbol of the feminine, often a symbol of the womb. But I also asked the artist to use that symbol because Mahatma Gandhi had said something very interesting, and Gandhi was, both a spiritual man and a political figure. And Gandhi said that he couldn't avoid politics because politics was like a snake that was encircling everything. So rather than ignore it, I choose to wrestle with the snake. Mahatma Gandhi said that. So that's why I wanted to use that symbol.
Wonderful. Well, Glenn, it's such a delight to have you with us. I mean, your book is so well timed. I love that the ancestors guided you to write that. And it's just really, really well timed. So just thank you so much. Any final words for people, invitations for them to read the book, and any final words here from your heart?
From my heart, I know this is a difficult time. I mean, it's a difficult time in the nation, and it's hard to see what's happening now and have any peace in your heart about it. It can be heartbreaking. But I do encourage you to read this book. If it helps provide a bigger picture, that would be great, because if we can stand back and observe what's happening right now with as wide a lens as possible, then we sometimes get the perspective to know that what's happening is actually part of nature. It's an unfolding. I mean, ultimately, when I'm talking about original politics, I mean natural politics, reuniting, doing things in concert with what is already unfolding in nature. And when we do that, we feel better. And we just feel healed in our own heart when we're moving in the right rhythm, not rushing, taking our time. If we feel better in our own heart, that will spread peace to our neighbors, and that's really important. It's probably the most important thing we can ever do. Thank you so much. Thank you for the conversation.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you, Glenn. Thank you.
yeah.
Really looking forward to your book. And, we've had lots of comments here, people from Jacksonville, Florida. We've had people from Australia commenting here. Just so, there's quite a few comments here. So we're glad that people enjoyed this conversation. Canada, Scotland, Pakistan. So, my friend, you've got a global audience, people who are hungry for what's been flowing through you. And thank you for being a clear channel and who you are and what you do. So, blessings to you, my friend.
And thank you for all you do. And thank you for the Shift Network. Thank you for Stephen. Thank you, everybody involved with it. So thank you. Many blessings.
Many blessings. And everyone who's watching or watching recording later, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, night, have a wonderful rest of your day. All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you all.